Okay, I wanted to give the Eon Shir, the Halacha Shir, on something that was near and dear to my heart. I told the seed guys, this week's parsha and last week's parsha, Hashem teaches us the most glorious and powerful nuclear mitzvah. It says, "V'shinantam levanecha v'dibarta bam," right? So we have to teach our children Torah, pass the torch. That glorious day that we accepted, we heard God Himself at Har Sinai. The Torah demands of us, and from this pasuk, by the way, we learn that we have to learn Torah and teach Torah, because it's two sides of the same coin, like I explained to you guys last Friday. So there's amazing, my Rosh Hashiva Talmud, Rabbi Lachman wrote, my Rosh Hashiva Zatzal Rav Weinberg was a big bucky in the Rambam. Every time he spoke about the Rambam. So, yeah, it's recording. Right now we're trying to understand something very simple. It says in the Torah, we read in the Shema 3 times a day, right? Don't forget, you say Shema in the morning and after at night, and then right before you sleep. 3 times a day we say V'shinantam levanecha. The most powerful of all the mitzvahs of the Torah is that we have to learn the Torah and teach it to our children. When? At every opportunity. When you rise up, when you sit down, when you're sitting in your house, when you're going on a trip, at every opportunity. The question we're trying to understand is, what exactly? I own Baruch Hashem K'nai almost 2,000 Svarim. So does that mean every sefer? The question number one is, what exactly do you need to teach your kid, right? The 5 books of Moses, the Chamisha Chumshei Torah. You need to teach him all of Shas or all of Mishnayos only. There's a 5-way machlokas, which is fascinating. And the question number one is, Rav Yisrael Salanter says something very fascinating. That Reuben says the most important thing you have to teach him is Mesilas Yesharos. That's true. He says one time Rav Yisrael Salanter saw a big businessman in Kovna, I think it was. So he said, how many hours a day do you learn? He came to Rabbi Yisrael Salanter. He said, Rebbe, I only have 1 hour a day to learn. So what should I learn? Should I learn Halacha? Should I learn Gemara? Should I learn Musar? Should I learn... I don't know, there's a lot of subjects, Baruch Hashem. Should I learn... So he said, learn Musar. If you learn Musar, you know that you have more than 1 hour a day. You're wasting a lot of your time. Once you learn Musar, you'll know that you have many more hours a day to learn. But anyways, Rabbi Yisrael Salanter says something also very important. We know the Gemara in Kiddushin says V'shinantam. What is Shinantam? Shinantam is a very unusual language. So the Gemara there says Shetiu divrei Torah mechudadim beficha. Shem yishalcha adam al titkamgem v'tomar lo el tomar lo miyad. V'shinantam means shinun. Shinun means that you're crystal clear. Like if somebody asks you a question in Torah, which is a black and white answer, right? It's like chapter and verse. You shouldn't be tegamgem. You shouldn't do etepete, like we say in Farsi. Like, I don't know, no. Finally, through trial and error, because you don't have clarity in the Torah and you didn't review it properly. That's not how you should learn Torah. Veshinantam means, the Gemara says, that you should have such a clear understanding, and it should be so inculcated in your soul. It should be so part and parcel of your being that when they ask you a question in Torah, not a complicated question that has to be analyzed, but black and white question, you should tell them right away. That's how razor sharp your learning should be. So Rav Yisrael Salanter learns from here, part of the mitzvah of learning Torah is not that it should go in one ear and go out the other, right? Unfortunately, as a rabbi, I have to say, you guys are in Santa Monica now, but a lot of times I felt a little bit burnt out. You spend 2-3 hours making a drasha for Yom Kippur, for the high holidays. You spend many hours. You spend almost 10-15 hours because, on Ne'ilah, 1,000 people come to the shul. So it's a big area. So, it's hard to know. Do people really appreciate it? Do they retain it? Or does it go in one ear and go out the other? Sometimes, you put all this sweat and tears. It's hard to know. So Rav Yisrael Salanter in Or Yisrael, and he says something very simple. Vishinantam means, he says, besides learning Torah, right? When you buy a watch, there's a goal. God, when he says learn Torah 24/7, right? You should constantly be reviewing the Torah with your children. Clearly, we see from the Gemara in Kiddushin, you have to retain that learning, which means you should be sharp and know it. Now, how much of that does that mean? You should know all of Shas? But when we're required to learn Torah, and we have to remember it, obviously we're observant Jews. We have to know the halacha, how to put on tefillin, how to eat matzah on Pesach. So that's the two questions we want to deal with. That you have to, Rabbi Yisrael Salanter says, and we see clearly from the Gemara, part of the mitzvah of Talmud Torah is that you should remember your learning. Does that mean you should know all of Chumash well? Does that mean you should review Mishnayos and know that all well? So it's a 5-way machlokes. So, and thirdly, there's a fascinating Ramah, which is actually in chapter Ramah in Shulchan Aruch. The laws of Talmud Torah, of teaching Torah, are in chapter 245, which is Ramah. And there's one of the Rishonim named the Ramah. We want to understand his Shita, which means he holds that a father, if you have the talent and you have the capability, you should teach your son everything. Or hire a student, a yeshiva, to teach him everything. Mishnah, Gemara, Halacha, Agada. And you have to pay for that, the Ramah says. So do we paskin like that, Ramah? Don't we the Chavetz Chaim happens to paskin like that, this Ramah in Sharish Tzion. But, and one more question is, there's also very cryptic Gemara. It says, there's a place in the Gemara, Kedushin Daf Lamed, says a father only has to teach his son Mikra, the written Torah, not the oral Torah. So do we paskin like the Gemara or not? So we're going to say the 5 different shitos. I was going to be mapalful. There's a whole, he goes through all the shitos, but Rosh Hashiva Zatzal Rav Weinberg, which is based on the Rambam, what does the Rambam say? How much Torah do you need to... Which means, the first question Hashem asks you when you get to heaven is, do you remember your learning? Kavata item la Torah, and there's a medrash there that Hashem says, you say you learned, okay, tell me by heart what you learned. This was the most powerful and life-changing mitzvah. It says Talmud Torah Keneged Kulam. You could put all of the 612 mitzvot on another side, and you put Talmud Torah on the other. So here's what the Rosh Hashiva says, based on the Rambam. He says, Chayav Adam lilmod kol haTorah shebichtav. Each person has a duty himself to learn the entire written Torah, which means to know how to read the Hebrew letters, even if you don't know what it means, and to learn the oral Torah. Now, what's under the written Torah? So, according to the Rambam, each Jew, and it's so sad that nobody learns Tanakh anymore. I was learning it with my son. The Midrash says it's such a beautiful thing. He brings all the Midrashim on Tanakh. But the Ramchal also passes like this. The Ramchal has a sefer actually that talks about the learning of Torah. He says that every Jew is incumbent for him to learn the 5 books of the Torah that Moshe gave us, and the other 24 books of Tanakh, Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim. And the main thing that you have to know is, even if you don't understand the meaning of the words, you have to have gone through it and actually know how to... It's interesting, it's above the scope of the shir, why the mitzvah of Torah Shebechtav is that you don't need to understand what the psukim mean, but that's what the written Torah says. Now, that's the written Torah. What's each Jew's job regarding the oral Torah? So he said, we know that the oral Torah is the Talmud Bavli, the Babylonian Talmud, which the Daf Yomi learns, but there's the Yerushalmi, it's the Safra, Sifri, Tosefta. So he says you have to know all the actual practical halachot that come out of all these different Talmudic commentary on the Torah. And the Rambam writes, I did you guys a favor. I wrote my magnum opus, the Mishneh Torah, the Yad HaChazaka. I went through all of Bavli, Yerushalmi, Safra, Sifri, and Tosefta, and I wrote all the practical halachas down. So the Rambam very clearly says that if you learn my books, the Rambam, it's like you learned the entire Torah. oral Torah, right? Because there's so many machlokeses, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Nassan, The Rambam takes care of that. He gives you crystal clear conclusion. So the Rambam says, if you want to be mekayim the mitzvah of learning the entire Torah, I've written encyclopedic work with clear conclusion of everything. You're yotze that. And something for the yeshiva bachrim, you see from here that regarding the Torah, the Talmud is called the Yama Talmud, right? It's a sea of knowledge. You see from here something very fundamental. That the mitzvah of Talmud Torah, yes, the pilpul, to understand the element, like right now I'm learning Choshen Mishpat, business, civil law. It's unbelievable how many ways you could analyze it and how many, it's just a ksois and a sivus that to argue why there's like lawyers, in front of the Supreme Court, lahavdil. There could be 70 or maybe 100 different angles of why, for example, if somebody is negligent, he has to pay double or whatever, right? And ways to analyze it. But you see something from here very important. There's a beginning to the Torah and an end to Torah. The Rambam says, you read the first book you open the first chapter of my book, the first page, I take you on a journey. From A to Z, everything about the halachic practical halachos. If you learn my book, I've covered the whole thing. And even though there's thousands of different disputes among the rabbi, I've decided who we paskin like based on, that's a whole other sugya. And now the problem with this, the Rosh Hashiva Zatzal just explained, is that only Yemenite Jews paskin like the Rambam, right? Most Jews today paskin like the Shulchan Aruch. Even the Ashkenazim, the Shulchan Aruch was Sephardi. So Rosh Hashiva Zatzal actually said that if a person wants to be mekayim this, he should learn the Aruch HaShulchan, because the Aruch HaShulchan wrote on Dalet Chilkei Shulchan Aruch, and he's an Achron and he's paskin, and you should know what Rav Moshe and Rav Henkin said. I learned the Aruch HaShulchan the whole day in Choshen Mishpat. He's like a modern Rambam, right? Since the Rambam wrote his book almost 1,000 years ago, another European rabbi, Rabbi Yechiel Michael Epstein, he wrote the Aruch HaShulchan, and so much so that for the Ashkenazim especially, the Ashkenazim, if the Mishnah Berurah argues on the Aruch HaShulchan, they pass him, Rav Moshe and Rav Henkin said we would go like the Aruch HaShulchan. Because the Aruch HaShulchan was a rabbi, the Mishnah Berurah is our Kohen Gadol Me'echav, he was obviously the Gadol Ador, but he was more academic, he wasn't paskening for people in real life situations, like a Rav, he was a Rosh Hashiva. So that's how you're Mekayim the thing. Now, something very important to understand is, I forgot to mention this, not only do you have to learn the Torah, you have to review it, and you have to teach it to your kid. So regarding those two aspects, the Rosh Hashiva based on the Rambam says like this: as long as you learn the Rambam or the Aruch HaShulchan, you yourself have committed what you need to do, and it's like you learned Talmud Bavli, Yerushalmi, Sifra, that whole shebang, and this is the same thing that you should never forget. So you have to review all of this, Rambam or Aruch HaShulchan, whatever book brings the practical conclusions of all the Talmudic sugyas, and remember it. So he says, this is exactly, so according to the Rambam, whatever you need to learn, you need to give it over to the next generation. That's what you have to teach your children. It's not two different chiyuvim, you understand? It's not like you have a certain amount of homework to do, certain stuff you need to learn, and then your kid is let him learn himself. No. If possible, whatever you need to learn, you need to teach your kid. Now, we know that this part of the shir I'm going to make a little bit shorter, but I wanted to go to Rav Moshe Feinstein's. Rav Moshe Feinstein, do you know what Rav Moshe Feinstein was? He was basically the Posek Achron of America. That my Chabad friends, Hasidic friends, give me a problem over Chal V'Yisrael. Rav Moshe gave that heter, but Rav Moshe has plenty of chumras. Rav Moshe has a fascinating, totally drastically different understanding, which is honestly very hard for me to absorb on a philosophical way how, because the only reason we Jews exist today is because of this mitzvah Vishinantam. We always were literate, not like other, third world nations. To be a Jew is to be a person that from the day a kid is 2-3 years old, we have to teach him Torah Sivalanu, Shema, how to read and write Hebrew. That's why, there was the Dark Ages and the Middle Ages, and many times throughout history, 99% of the population, a lot of the people, only the elite knew how to read and write, right? But to be a Jew, Lord Jonathan Sacks, the chief rabbi of England, wrote such a beautiful essay that, we take it for granted. How Judaism creates, Baruch Hashem, they should be ethical and good, but the greatest lawyers, the greatest professors, the greatest people that win the Nobel Peace Prize are always Jewish. It's not a coincidence. Because this myth, the Torah is saying 24/7, what should you have in your mind? You should be obsessed with memorizing the Torah, analyzing the Torah, knowing, the Torah. Now, Rav Moshe has a fascinating understanding of the mitzvah of Talmud Torah. Then I'm going to read you what Rav Ovadia Yosef, our Sephardic Posek, talks about it, and then we're going to finish this year, and I'm just going to say a short and sweet Dvar Torah on the Parsha, because Rabbi Netanelli told me that my mission in life is about this card, so I don't want to forget about the Parsha. Rav Moshe Feinstein, and those people that want to look it up, it's in Igros Moshe, Yeridea Chelik Beis, Siman Kuf Yud, and he talks about it again in Yeridea Chelik Dalid, Tshuva Lamed Vav, subcategory Tet. Rav Moshe Feinstein says, does anybody learn Daf Yomi here? Ruben, did you ever learn Daf Yomi? I'm a Daf Yomi guy. I gave Daf Yomi.
Amud Yomi.
Oh, you do Amud Yomi, yeah. I actually had a Chavrus in the mirror. It was a Talmud Mukha, Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky. Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky said, Daf Yomi started almost 100 years ago, 80, 90 years ago. He said that time people were much more learned and had much more time. He said for our generation, Amud Yomi is more. But Rav Moshe Feinstein says that every Jew has a obligation to learn the entire Torah and to both the written and the oral. But listen to this part. He argues on I didn't want to go into the different shitas of the Aruch HaShulchan and Shulchan Aruch HaRav. It's above the scope of our thing. Let's go to Rav Moshe. I skipped to Rav Moshe and I'm going to say the Birkas Shmuel. Rav Moshe Feinstein says that he argues and says that every Jew has to know the 5 books of Moses, of the Torah. It's not enough. You're not used to the mitzvah of Talmud Torah by just knowing how to read it. Rather, you have to learn the Rashi on it. You have to understand what it actually means philosophically, like the context of it. It's not enough to just learn how to read it. Like the Rambam, the Aruch HaShulchan, the Shulchan Aruch HaRav, many of the poskim hold like that. Rav Moshe argues. And the Rav Moshe says something even more that Rav Ovadia vehemently is upset about and argues. Rav Moshe Feinstein says, if you learn Daf Yomi, then he says the mitzvah of Talmud Torah is to learn Daf Yomi, to know all of Shas. You know that there's a famous story where Moshe Feinstein, one time his grandson, or I don't know who called him, and he said, I'm giving a siyum on Shas. He said, of course, Zaidi, you gave a siyum. He said, no, this is the 101st time I finished all the Talmud. And it has like 20,000 pages. So Rav Moshe, and I'll read for you what he if you look in the Tshuva there, he says there's no chiyuv to learn it bi'iyun, Rav Moshe says. But he says those people that learn Daf Yomi, which is the biggest class, I would think, in the world, right? Hundreds of thousands of people learn the same page of Gemara every day, 7.5 years. They learn it. That's considered entire Torah Shabbal Peh. Clearly not like the Rambam. Clearly not like the Rosh Hashiva Zatzal's understanding. Clearly not like the Aruch HaShulchan. And he says the same thing is, you have to review it as much as possible and know that. Now, what do you need to teach your kid? Whatever. Rav Moshe holds that if you want to be the Yates of the mitzvah of Talmud Torah for your kid, Torah Shabbal Peh, the oral Torah, you have to teach him Shas. That's it. Now, like I said before, he argues on all the other Mefarshim. He says that The Torah Shebechtav, just to know how to read it and not know what it means, is worthless. Rav Moshe says. He says the entire. That's why, by the way, I felt embarrassed. I have a friend. He's very quirky, Rav Avram. He knows a lot of Kabbalah. So one told me he told me a fascinating Kabbalistic understanding of a Rashi. And I felt embarrassed. I had not learned Chumash Rashi since high school. I mean, you look up some Rashis, but you do. But I think it's very important. And, Rashi was written al Pi Ruach HaKodesh. And the Shulchan Aruch Paskins, the Halacha, that if you want to be, we have a chiyuv every week to read the Parsha twice. And the translation once. So the Shulchan Aruch Maran, Rabbi Yosef Karo, writes that if you want to do this mitzvah, Mina Mufchar, you should do all the Unkulus, but Unkulus is not enough. You should do every single Rashi. Because the true understanding of the written Torah is only with Rashi. And the Grozal says, the reason why our rabbis, by the way, you know what the benefit of doing this mitzvah of Shnai Mikra Chatargim is? You have a long life. The Grozal writes, the exact reason Chazal, our rabbis, decreed that we have to do this, is to know, to be Mekayim the mitzvah of Talmud Torah. So Rav Moshe goes very good with the Grozal. That's what the Grozal understands, that the whole mitzvah of Talmud Torah Shebechtav at least, is to know Chumash Rashi, to know Chumash with its meaning, and the true meaning is only understood through Rashi. Now, I just wanted to say, we have Yeshiva Bachrim here, so I would be remiss not to say how Rav Baruch Ber understands it. He has an even total different understanding of what our obligation vis-a-vis learning Torah is. Rav Baruch Ber says like this, it's in I believe Birka Shmuel is Chidushim on this sugya, Chav Zayin, where the sugya of Talmud Torah is. Rav Baruch Ber says, every person needs to teach himself the entire Torah. He says a tremendous chiddush. He says that he agrees to the Rambam. Whatever you need to learn, you need to give it over to the next generation, to your children. And by the way, if you have the zechut, and I give you all a bracha to learn with your grandchildren, the Gemara in Kiddushin says that if a grandchild sits on your lap and you teach him the Torah that you learned, it's like Har Sinai. It's like you're right, because you see that the Torah has been transmitted from generation to generation. It's such a glorious and wonderful scene. You have to imagine that, this is like literally what Har Sinai is. Now the Birkat Shmuel says there's no limit to Torah. I guess the Yeshiva Sho'ilam holds like Rav Shmuel, the Birkat Shmuel, Rav Baruch Ber. He says, in my opinion, the Torah is limitless, right? I want to tell you, I had a friend, a Chavrusa, he told me something so beautiful from his grandfather. He said, my grandfather's almost 100 years old, and he was crying to his grandson. He became so emotional. He said, I've been going to shul ever since I was a little tiny boy, maybe 6-7 years old. And every week my father would say a Dvar Torah to me, and then later my friends would tell. He says, can you believe it? I've been going to shul almost 100 years, and every week, it's not, I read the Parshas for almost 100 times, right? You're in shul. And he says, every week I see something new that I never saw, even though it's the 100th time before, right? So that's how Rav Shmuel, the Birka Shmuel understands. He says the Torah is honestly limitless, and he actually says something I like. He says there's no one size fits all, right? That's how Rav Moshe, and I want to tell you how Rav Avadia understands it in a second, but he says that everybody, like we said in the Misat Yesharim, everybody should be the best you could be. So depending on your IQ and your mental capacity, you should become a goyin, a genius in Torah according to your mental capacity. That's what the obligation you have to carry out and fulfill the mitzvah of Talmud Torah is. And so he says, and that's the same thing you should convey to your child, right? So if you have one child that's more of a businessman, according to the Birka Shmuel, Rav Baruch Ber, he says, okay, you don't have to push him, right? You see that his mind doesn't absorb Torah so much. So, authentically speaking, everybody should try to be the best according to his mental capabilities. And he says, if you do even 1%, a quarter of a percent, 0.1% less than your potential of being a genius in Torah, and he says you haven't even committed the mitzvah of Talmud Torah, right? So Rav Avadia in his sefer of Halichot Olam, he's very, very upset that people don't know halacha. So I'll read you what he writes regarding the mitzvah of Talmud Torah. Polar opposite of Rav Moshe. Now I'm going to tell you a fascinating fact of history. It seems the Sfardim were almost always with like that Sfardim always, I just want to let you know, we're always very into the practical bottom line. Tell me the bottom line. Not that you shouldn't learn Gemara, of course, but they always took precedence. So Rav Avadia says, Balabatim, regular people that are not in Kolo, that only have 2-3 hours a day to learn. He says the only thing they should be learning is Mishnah Berurah, is Shulchan Aruch, and its modern commentaries like Halacha Beruchara or Yalkut Yosef, right? Because even the Shulchan Aruch is a little bit ambiguous. It's written almost 500 years ago. And he says, the main mitzvah of Torah, why do we learn Torah? Why does, they had almost 2-3, the Gemara Kedushin says, but Usha, they had a big fight, the rabbis. What's more important? Action, doing the mitzvah, or learning Torah? Right? So some rabbis said, right, Hamaisa Kodim the Talmud, to carry out a mitzvah, but he says unanimously in Usha, where the Sanhedrin was, they came to the conclusion that what takes precedence above anything else? Talmud Torah. Why? Talmud maybe lidei maisa. Ignorance is bliss. If you don't know what tefillin is, if you don't know what Shabbat is, if you don't know what it breaks my heart. My son-in-law, he was asked by a family member, it makes me cry so deeply that there's somebody we know in Baltimore. The mother refused to get her children to get a Brit Milah. And I was telling my son-in-law, I said, you don't say that they're anti-religion. She grew up in a place that was not even it was in Towson, Maryland. That part of Baltimore County, not even one Jew lived, right? So Rav Avadia says basically, the reason why we have to learn Torah, and Torah takes precedence, is because when you learn Torah, you know how to carry out the mitzvot, right? I'm sorry, if this mother knew how important Brit Milah was, when the parents don't take their child, they live in a community that doesn't have even 2 Jews, no synagogue, right? And they never go to shul. So she becomes a person that is ignorant, and she thinks it's barbaric. I tried convincing her. My father-in-law tried convincing her. She didn't let her kids get a Brit Milah. Now she wants her son to get a bar mitzvah, which is a good thing. Not a ceremony though, just the party. She wants him to say a speech. But I'm telling you, I know this person. If she would have gotten education, right? She just doesn't know what Brit Milah is. If she did, her husband's non-Jewish, obviously. He's also against it. But if they would have had education, so Rav Avadia basically makes this compelling argument. He says the bottom line is, you shouldn't put your tefillin here or here or here on your eyes, or there's so many details in halacha, how to carry out the mitzvot appropriately, that Rav Avadia paskins that if you, up to 3 hours a day, if you're learning, you have to learn strictly halacha. Obviously, you would say you could learn a little bit musar. He says you shouldn't learn Gemara at all. This is Halichot Olam, Hilchot Talmud Torah, page Shin Lamed Zayin, in the last chelik of Halichot Olam. And he says, now listen to what he says here. Absolutely different than Rav Moshe and the Rav Baruch Ber. He says a person a balabas that doesn't do this, enam yotzin klal yedei chovat mitzvah Talmud Torah. He says if you don't know all the practical halachas, right, and you just spend learning Gemara the whole day, he says you have not done the mitzvah of Talmud Torah at all, right? So it's a fascinating. It's like the polar opposite of Moshe, and Rav Avadia says that's why it says in the end of the Gemara and Brachot and Nida kol hasholeh halachot b'chol yom muftach lo shalom haba. And Rav Avadia says it black and white. He says the people that learn Daf Yomi, they have not committed the mitzvah of Talmud Torah, right? Why? Because already the Rebbe of the Rambam's father, what was the Rambam's father's name? Maimun. He says the Rebbe of the Rambam's father said already, this was already almost 1100 years ago. The Rimi Gash was one of the first Rishonim. He writes in his Shalos Teshuvos that already 1100 years ago, we don't have the power of how to extrapolate halacha from Gemara, because there's so many different opinions. So which one is supposed to follow? He says that's why we have to learn the words of the Geonim, right? So you had the Tanaim that wrote the Mishnah, the Amoraim that wrote the Gemara, then the thing, right? So Rav Ovadia says that what's the point of learning Gemara where nothing practical comes out of it, right? You don't know how to do any mitzvah because you don't know the details. But bottom line, he says once you have more than 4 hours a day of learning, you can learn Gemara. That's what he says. So he says then you could learn Gemara and learn Tur Bet Yosef and stuff like that. And it's the right thing to do. I just want to say something very fascinating with this. I'm going to finish. We're going to say the opinion of the Chazon Ish, which is also fascinating, and the opinion of the Mishnah Berurah. You have to know that the Gra writes that we said, so part of Talmud Torah is teaching it to the next generation, but we said one of the most important parts of Torah is that you have to review it. But so the Gra gives us a wonderful, Rav Sternberg writes it in Shuvas on Hagos. He says the Gra told Rav Chaim Velazhiner the right way to review Gemara is to learn the Alfasi. You know what the Alfasi is? So the first person that saw that it's basically, he was before the Rimigash. He saw that it's impossible to understand how to keep Shabbat from the Gemara. It's so much. Sometimes a lot of Hilchot Shabbat is in Menachos, right? So the Ri Alfasi, Rabbi Yitzchak Alfasi, which was from Africa, actually, from Morocco and Northern Africa, he went and wrote a concise Talmud. He took out all the opinions that are not la halacha. He concised it. And I just want to say something fascinating. Rabbi David Katz, which is a PhD, John Hopkins, I think he's the biggest expert outside of Israel on Jewish history. He said in the yeshiva of the Ran, isn't it funny, the Ran has a pirush on the Rif, because he says in Sephardic yeshivas, like Rav Ovadia holds, this is our Messiah, we were so into the practical conclusion, right? Rabbi, in the end of the day, the Gemara says 10 different opinions, 10 different ways, but tell me what the final ruling is. So he says, it's very fascinating that in the yeshiva of the Ran, they did not learn Gemara. They learned Alfasi, which was a shortened version. He takes out like almost 60-70% of the Gemara that's pilpul, and it's the stuff that's not la halacha. So that's the Messiah, and he brings, it wasn't only the Ran's yeshiva, many other yeshivas. Just to end off with the Chazon Ish. The Chazon Ish says I love this chiddush. He says a beautiful chiddush. He says that you have to teach your son Torah, midin Talmud Torah of Shinantam, that you only need to teach him Mikra. There's other poskim that hold like this also, but he says, why do we see in the Gemara that you also have to teach your son Torah Shabbat Peh? So he says another fascinating chiddush. He says it's incumbent upon every father to do chinuch, right? Moshe Chaim, proper chinuch. So he says that you have to make sure your son goes to yeshiva and learns Gemara and Halacha and Musar and all those other great things. That's not the mitzvah of Talmud Torah of Shinantam, which is to learn Torah and to teach it. That's midin chinuch, right? That's midin the chinuch, that the same way you have to teach your son from a small age, 3 years old, to say Shema, right? It's so beautiful. My grandchildren, my daughter, already from a few months old, they do Netila. The Chazon Ish said you want to holy kids. So there's a mitzvah of chinuch, which is a whole different sugya, which means every father and mother, really the mitzvah of chinuch is not the father only, but practically speaking, the mother is with the kids more. You have to train your kids, right, before bar mitzvah, that when they become bar mitzvah, they know how to carry out the entire Torah, right? To say a bracha, to do this, do that. So the Chazon Ish says anything that Chazal say, you have to learn Torah Shabbat Peh, that's midin chiyuch. He says, v'chiyuv ze ein lo gvul shavakal, lo kol echad chay b'tem l'ma'alasei, b'maisim tovim b'tochim b'Hashem. So the Chazon Ish is sounding like Rab Baruch Bar Leibowitz. He says, And that you have to do chinuch to this child depends how smart the child is, right? Sometimes, I'm sorry to say this, and I don't want to offend anybody. There was a guy in my shul, he went out with 100 girls. And my God, I was the number one reference. On any given day, I would get a call from France. I'm not kidding, Canada, England. His father was on a mission to get him married, and he talked to every shotgun in the world. And I was the number one reference. I was like, where is this thing from? So you have to understand, like, I'm sorry. There's a halacha that you should get married by 18 or 22 or 24. But I'm sorry, in our day and age, you have some 24-year-olds. They're not even as mature as a 15-year-old. And it was good that he didn't get married. Because if he would have gotten married at that time, he would have got divorced. Me and my father were trembling. Because we were the number one reference. They would call me or my father Zechron Livracha. And he was not mature. He was not ready. So, it is something very practically, based on my experience, that everybody has their own potential. You understand? Everybody's their own world. So the Chazon Ish says, how much does a father need to be mechanech his son? If he sees his son could be the next Gadol Hador, then you better invest a lot of, money, time, and effort to teach him all of Shas. But if midin mitzvah Talmud Torah, the Chazon Ish holds that you only need to learn him with him Chamisha Chumshei Torah. The rest is midin chinuch. How does our Kohen HaGadol mi'echav pasken? The Chavetz Chaim, like I mentioned in the beginning of the shir, the Chavetz Chaim paskins that it's a mitzvah to teach your son Mishnah, Talmud, Halachos, Agados, like the Pashat Divrei Harama, which means the basic Shas and Shulchan Aruch is something that should be is incumbent upon the father to make sure that his son, obviously, if he doesn't know it himself, he needs to hire people to teach him. If he knows it himself, they can learn together. That's the most classical chavrusa, by the way. Because, by the way, there really shouldn't be anything as yeshiva. I just want to say this parenthetically. Rosh Yeshiva said this. Do you know that yeshiva is a downgrade? Who would be the best teacher? The Torah itself is telling you in the Shema twice, both in the first paragraph and the second paragraph. The number one Rebbe that for sure the student is the apple of his eye is the father, because he's obviously going to care about him the most. But Yoshua ben Gamla, the Kohen Gadol, the Gemara in Baba Basra says, Baram Zachur Atol Ishatov. After the destruction of the second temple, so I just want to tell you, historically, a lot of people don't know this. Before the second temple, many Jews, the default way was, people didn't used to go to school. There was so much blessing in the world, the father would work half day. Half day he would sit his son on his lap and teach him all the Torah, right? That he knew. But what happened is, after the destruction of the second Bet HaMikdash, there were so many orphans. So, what do you mean? You have hundreds of thousands of orphans. So they don't deserve to learn? The system didn't work. Because, the Torah, like I told you guys on Friday, the Maharal says something very important. Torah sivalanu, Moshe Morasha Keilat Yaakov. The Torah wasn't given to me and you. It's given to a nation as a whole, right? One nation under God. So Chazal, the rabbi, said, listen, even though God wanted that the ultimate teacher, who should teach each, who's the Rebbe? Who's the teacher of each Jewish child? The father. Because the father, this is the apple of his eye. He's going to make sure that he's going to get the best chinuch. See, Moshe Chaim left. He's going to get proper chinuch. But they said, in honor of the orphans, that they're not going to have any. They said then everybody needs to. This whole mitzvah that we gave today regarding teaching your kids, they made a yeshiva system. Because, and the Gemara says, even though it's a downgrade, because really, most of the time, practically speaking, the teacher's not going to care about the student as much as the father. But he said, it's better, the Torah shouldn't be forgotten. Because those orphans, those people that their fathers were crucified and killed by the Romans, and the destruction of the second Beis HaMikdash was still in the month above, it was better to downgrade that. So thank you. And maybe we'll revisit this subject more next time. Thank you.